Multilateralism is the right way to keep the international order stable and promote humanity's development and progress. The rules must apply equally to everyone. A handful of countries should not enjoy privileges based on their strengths, and the world must not return to the law of the jungle where the strong bully the weak. Every country is entitled to defend its legitimate rights and interests.
He Feng there, China's vice premier and Beijing's top trade negotiator, speaking at the World Economic Forum in Davos, and he presented China as an advocate of cooperation, free trade, and multilateralism, reiterating many of Beijing's frequent talking points, of course, while He Feng insists that China backs this real rules-based global order. Obviously, there are a lot of questions about Taiwan emerge, right? And whether Taiwanese independence remains a clear red line. Beijing has been ratcheting up pressure, staging its most expansive military drills in decades near the island last month, including a live-fire exercises and even no-fly warnings. And Chinese President Xi Jinping has told the People's Liberation Army it should work to become what he calls a world-class military. 2027 marks the centenary of the PLA, and some U.S. defense planners have linked that date to a potential attack on Taiwan. But Chinese officials dismissed that notion of any timeline for any invasion. Now, Washington has long maintained a policy of strategic ambiguity when it comes to Taiwan, but the U.S. has helped arm the island, including an $11 billion weapons sale announced in December. Beijing maintains it has a right to take the island by force, if necessary, to prevent its formal independence.
People talking about the status quo in Taiwan Strait. I would argue there is no status quo that is static. Yeah, with each provocation and with each response from the PLA, the status quo would be changed irreversibly, toward the favor of the Chinese mainland.
If China attacks Taiwan is the title of the December report and study out of the German Marshall Fund that's gamed out two scenarios of how that conflict might develop. Joining us now to talk us through this is the co-author of the report, Zach Cooper, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Also with us here to join the conversation is Stephen Engel, our Chief North Asia Correspondent. Zach, good morning from the Asia Pacific. Thank you for joining us. Well, let me just get maybe started with the obvious and the simple. What was the rationale behind the study? What is the objective here? That you guys want to shed light on?
Well, thanks, David. I think the key question for us was we spend so much time looking at scenarios in which the United States loses a conflict over Taiwan. And as an American, we test out those scenarios to understand where our weak points are. But sometimes it implies that actually in any conflict, the U.S. would struggle and that China would be wildly successful. I think most of us believe the opposite. And so this was an effort to look at what the cost to China would be in four different areas. We looked at economic costs, we looked at domestic political costs, military costs, and then diplomatic or reputational costs. And the surprise to me was that I think in all four areas, the costs are quite high. I wouldn't assert that they will be enough to deter Xi Jinping if he feels that he has to take action, but I think the costs are probably higher than most people would otherwise assume.
Can you walk us through some of the costs, whether it's economically, militarily, and even social stability? I know you have four pillars there of what some of the scenarios that you've laid out.
Yeah, I think some of the most obvious costs are the economic ones, and Bloomberg has done a great job demonstrating how costly this is. Some of the data that's come out has suggested it could be close to, let's say, 10 to 15% of GDP. So that's obviously a significant figure as a conflict goes on. But what we try to do is break this down into two different kinds of contingencies. One, which was a relatively minor skirmish, and then a second, which was a much larger war. And I think what you see is that over the course of these two conflicts, they look very different. So a minor skirmish, the costs are relatively small and they're sort of short term, whereas a major war, these are massive costs. They take a very long time to deal with, and they could last for many years. And so if you look at the economic costs, it's not just in terms of trade. the point in which there's a conflict, it's also what happens to trade and supply chains long after that. Just one other item I would highlight is I think some of the work here on the domestic stability threats is really new and important. And one of the takeaways for me was that the challenges that Xi Jinping might face in a failed conflict could be huge, not just for the People's Liberation Army, but also for the other Chinese domestic security services that would be responsible for upholding order in the aftermath of a failed conflict.
Zach, Steve Engel here. I see the result, or the report essentially goes into the results of these different scenarios and the outcomes. How much goes into the rationale for doing so? Because I also see that, again, the German Marshall Fund is a nonpartisan organization that essentially advances transatlantic partnership. I want to kind of bring that to the fore with today's headlines, with what's happening between the United States and Europe. When we're talking about the rationale, does the calculus of essentially a deterioration of cross-Atlantic alliance between U.S. and Europe embolden Beijing to carry out one of these scenarios, or does it essentially undermine what they've been talking about at Davos, and that is they are the responsible world power right now?
Yeah, I think a lot of people would have sort of chuckled at the comments that you aired from He Feng. But now I think those are going to appeal to a lot of countries who are watching what the United States is doing with Greenland and has done with Venezuela. I think at the end of the day, this really does undermine security in East Asia. And one of the reasons is that so many of the costs of China depend on international responses. And yes, the US might be the biggest player there. Japan is certainly critical, as are South Korea, Australia, and others. But Europe has a really important role to play. And one thing that the Biden team had been pretty good at was getting a lot of European allies and partners on board with at least contemplating strong responses to a Chinese use of force against Taiwan. I think it's going to be a pretty hard sell these days for the United States to be asking Europe to take on, let's say, the anti-coercion mechanism that they've developed and use it against China. In fact, they're talking about using it against the United States over Greenland. And so I think this absolutely undermines deterrence. It doesn't mean that I would expect Xi Jinping to take action against Taiwan anytime soon, but I think it is damaging the cross-strait stability that we all hope will be able to be maintained over the next few years.
Zach, just looking at the major war scenario that you guys are playing out, I just want to ask what the assumption is of the study in terms of the extent of U.S. military involvement.
So in the major war scenario, we assumed a pretty great extent of U.S. involvement. And the reason is, if you're a Chinese military planner, one of your incentives is to go big and go early. And what I mean by that is you can either leave U.S. forces alone across the region, or you can strike them very hard, very early. If you don't strike them early, you put at risk Chinese forces that would be very vulnerable to U.S. attacks, especially large amphibious vessels that would need to cross the strait. Remember, we're probably talking 300,000 to 400,000 Chinese troops that would have to land on Taiwan, and they're not swimming there. They've got to get there on boats. Those are extremely vulnerable platforms. And so we assumed in the major war scenario that the Chinese would probably try and strike U.S. assets, whether that could be a U.S. aircraft carrier right at the outset, or facilities in Okinawa, Guam, and elsewhere. And from my standpoint, that means the U.S. has to fight. I know, every American president has their own predilections on this issue, but I think if you saw a 5,000 person U.S. carrier disabled somewhere in the Pacific, I think Americans would probably force the president to fight. So that was our assumption. And I'll say, of course, these scenarios would look really different if the U.S. wasn't so engaged. And so the minor skirmish we looked at had a much lower level of engagement, where we really had just Taiwan and China fighting it out. And you see very different costs to China in that scenario.
But Zach, you also, in both of these scenarios, conclude that the PLA would not be victorious, correct? And if you're sending missiles to U.S. bases in Japan and to Guam, that would almost assuredly bring the United States into a full-on war, which would sort of undermine the main objective there of Beijing, and that is unification with Taiwan.
Yeah, Stephen, I think that's right. And, one of our going in assumptions for this project was to look at what happened in a failed Chinese effort. So we weren't trying to examine the possibility that China might succeed. But I'll say, as somebody that used to do war planning at the Pentagon, my assumption is still that China would be very successful in the first few days of a conflict. And then they would bog down, particularly in an amphibious conflict where they'd have to transit such a difficult body of water with so many troops and keep them supplied. This is an incredibly difficult operation. And you're talking about a military that hasn't done anything of this sort, a major conflict, since 1979, and they lost that conflict. So this is really hard for even the best militaries. And so my assumption and our assumption in this report is that the Chinese side would have a huge amount of trouble trying to carry out those types of operations. But even if they were moderately successful, many of these costs still apply, right? The economic costs, the cost of the military, they would still be quite serious.
And Zach, I have to bring it back to kind of the news of late, right? It took days for the U.S., for example, to take over Venezuela and its leader, Maduro. In your view, do you think that there is a feasible scenario where this could be a very swift and total Chinese victory of Taiwan?
So I do think we have to worry about what I would call a decapitation strike, which is essentially what the United States did with Venezuela. I will admit, even I was surprised at how proficient the U.S. was in carrying out that operation. I doubt that the Chinese could do anything similar. But the scenario that a lot of us have worried about is whether they could do, let's say, missile strikes with very little warning against the Taiwanese presidential compound. Is that possible? Perhaps. I think it's unlikely, and it wouldn't necessarily give them control over the island. But in the aftermath of the Venezuela operation, I think both Taiwan and China are probably looking much more seriously at decapitation strikes and probably preparing either to threaten to use them or to defend against them. And so this is something that I would think the Taiwan military is going to be looking at very seriously and trying to think about probably bolstering some of the defenses around the presidential office and some of the key defense ministry compounds.
So, Zach, we've laid out the potential consequences in both cases. What's the conclusion? Is the undertaking worth undertaking?
Well, my view has always been that actually Xi Jinping is relatively risk averse when it comes to these kinds of major decisions. And so I think this just adds fuel to that argument that the cost of this sort of operation would be so high that it would be a pretty huge risk and unlikely to be successful. And therefore, it's not something that he should do unless he feels that he's absolutely boxed in. And I don't see Lai Ching-te, I don't see Donald Trump boxing Xi Jinping in the next couple of years. And so that makes me somewhat more confident that although I think we're going to have a very difficult period between now and, let's say, 2028, when there are elections in Taiwan, that I think we can hopefully maintain deterrence. And so the big takeaway for me is just about how huge these costs are in very different areas and how difficult they would be for Beijing to manage. And so I think that is a cautionary tale for Chinese leaders when they're thinking about potentially taking military actions against Taiwan.